She was alone on the cold marble floor, with a piece of cake wrapped in aluminum foil and her hands trembling from exhaustion. It was her birthday, 25 years old, and all she had was that heavy silence, the distorted reflection in the mirrored walls, and the certainty that no one cared. Then the door opened, and a man in an impeccable suit stopped in the doorway, looked at her, then at the cake, and said with gentle irony, "If I'd known about the party, I would have brought balloons." Jade looked up with such a sharp jolt that the fork fell to the floor. And it was there, in that unexpected moment, that something began. Something she didn't know if she wanted, but could no longer ignore. But before diving into this story that will touch every fiber of your heart, tell me, where are you watching from? What city? What country brought you here today? Jade never expected anything from her birthday. She'd learned as a child that expectations were traps disguised as hope, and she'd fallen for them far too many times. At 25, as she ran the damp cloth over the glass table in the most luxurious office she'd ever cleaned, all she felt was the weight of her own exhaustion. The silence around her was so thick it almost had texture. Olympia, with its fine, steady drizzle, seemed to conspire to make that day exactly like every other, grey, empty, forgettable. She pulled her worn backpack from inside the supply closet, sat down on the cold marble floor, and took out a piece of cake wrapped in aluminum foil. No candles, no singing, just her, the distorted reflection in the mirrored walls, and the muffled sound of her own breathing. She brought the fork to her mouth with trembling hands, not from cold, but from accumulated exhaustion. She'd worked in 3 houses before this one, and there were still 2 more to go. The sugar from the cake went down heavy, almost bitter, as if even that knew there was no reason to celebrate. That's when the door opened. Jade looked up with such a sharp jolt that the fork slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a piercing clink. Edward Crane stood in the doorway, impeccable suit, tie slightly loosened, and that expression she still couldn't read. Something between curiosity and gentleness. He looked at her, then at the cake, then back at her, and then he said, with an almost imperceptible touch of irony, "If I'd known about the party, I would have brought balloons." Jade's face grew hot. She lowered her eyes and mumbled a stumbling apology as she stood too quickly, nearly tripping over her own worn shoe. She tried to put the cake back in her backpack, but her fingers wouldn't quite obey. He raised a hand, as if calling for a truce. "Hey, sorry, didn't mean to startle you." His voice was different from the tone he used in meetings, lower, more human. Jade forced a brief smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, and said she was finishing up. But then he asked, without hurry, "Can I sit? You look like you need company more than supervision." She froze. No one, absolutely no one, had offered her company that day, or any other day, if she was being honest. Jade had learned not to expect gestures like that, because they always came with some hidden intention, some future debt. But there was something about the way he waited, without forcing an answer, that disarmed her. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no either. She just sat back down, slowly, like someone testing the firmness of the ground before trusting it with their own weight. They stayed there for a few minutes. He didn't ask why she was alone. He didn't make jokes about the simple cake or about the fact that she was eating on the floor. He just stayed, and that unassuming silence, that presence that demanded nothing, was what disturbed her most. Because Jade didn't know how to handle kindness without noise. She was used to shouting, to demands, to affection that came wrapped in conditions. But this was different, and different, for her, had always been synonymous with danger. When she finally said goodbye and left the building, the fine rain wet her face as she walked toward the bus. Jade pressed her fingers against her palm, feeling her nails dig into her skin. It was her way of coming back, of anchoring herself before the anxiety carried her too far. But that night, for the first time in a long while, something inside her whispered an uncomfortable question. What if someone had actually seen who she was, without wanting anything in return? The next day, Jade arrived at the building with the strange feeling of someone who'd slept poorly from overthinking. She changed clothes in the cramped basement locker room, tied her hair in a tight bun, and went up to the 10th floor with the same posture as always: straight shoulders, neutral gaze, silent steps. No one needed to know she'd spent the entire night replaying that conversation, or rather, that silence, with Edward Crane. No one needed to know that. For the first time in years, something had cracked the surface of her self-control. She'd barely started cleaning the conference room when she heard Kingsley Doyle's voice echoing down the hallway. "Jade, you've been called to his office." The tone was too neutral to be innocent. Jade felt her stomach tighten. Being called to the CEO's office wasn't protocol, not for someone like her. She cleaned, organized, disappeared. That was the natural order of things. Kingsley watched her with a thin smile, almost imperceptible, as she added, "Looks like you impressed someone yesterday." The phrase came with a calculated pause, and Jade understood the insinuation perfectly. She went up 2 more floors, feeling each heartbeat echo in her ears. She knocked on the frosted glass door and heard the "come in" before she could even process what she'd do inside. Edward was standing by the window, looking at the rain that insisted on falling over Olympia like a grey, endless curtain. When he saw her, he turned and pointed to a chair. "Sit, please." Jade stayed where she was. He sighed, but didn't seem irritated, just tired. "I need you to review the priority list for the common areas. Some details are being overlooked." Jade frowned. That didn't make sense. Reviewing lists wasn't her job. There were supervisors, coordinators, people paid to do exactly that. She crossed her arms slowly, not realizing she was adopting a defensive posture. "With all due respect, Mr. Crane, that's not my area." He gave a half smile, one of those that carries an unspoken truth. "I know, but you notice things no one else sees. So I figured you'd be the right person." The way he said it, without hurry, without demand, made something strange happen inside her. A mixture of irritation and dark confusion, because no one had ever asked for her opinion, and now he was doing exactly that. She sat down, but kept her spine straight, like someone ready to leave at any moment. Edward pulled up a chair and sat on the other side of the table, at a proximity that wasn't intimidating, but also wasn't impersonal. "You know what I noticed yesterday?" He tilted his head slightly, like someone about to share a secret. "You're the only person here who doesn't try to impress me." Jade felt her face grow hot. She didn't know if that was a compliment or a provocation, but before she could respond, he continued, "And that's rare. More than you'd think." The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. He showed her the list, asked a few questions, listened to her answers with genuine attention. But Jade knew, with that sharp perception that came from years of learning to read between the lines, that this wasn't about lists. It was about continuing the conversation he'd started the day before. And that bothered her deeply, because she didn't know how to react to someone who wanted nothing from her except to be there. Simply be there. When she went back down to the work floor, Kingsley was already waiting. "So, what did he want?" The question came with a look Jade knew well. That mix of curiosity and suspicion that always preceded gossip. Jade answered in the flattest voice she could manage. "To review priorities." Kingsley let out a low chuckle. "Right, priorities." And then, as she walked away, she murmured something Jade pretended not to hear, but that stuck deep. "Careful, honey. Anyone who gets too much attention around here ends up losing their footing." Jade spent the rest of the day cleaning harder than necessary, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless, as if she could also erase that uncomfortable feeling Edward Crane had left in her. Because for the first time in a long while, someone had seen beyond the invisible cleaning lady, and that gaze that pierced through the layers she'd built so carefully, was exactly what she feared most. The following days brought a routine that seemed the same, but no longer was. Jade kept cleaning the same hallways, organizing the same rooms, disappearing at the same times. But now there was something different in the air, a presence she felt even before seeing it. Edward Crane started showing up in the places where she worked, not in an obvious way, not with flimsy excuses. He was just there. Walking down the hallway when she straightened the pictures, getting coffee in the break room while she emptied the trash cans, and worse, he watched her, not with that vague look of someone merely registering movement, but with real attention, like someone trying to decipher a new language. Jade tried to ignore it, pretended not to notice, picked up her pace, kept her eyes fixed on her tasks, as if extreme concentration could make her invisible again. But it was useless, because every time he passed by, he left something in the air, an unasked question, a silence that demanded an answer. And that was starting to crack the armor she put on every day before leaving home. She didn't like it. Didn't like feeling that someone was paying too much attention, because attention in her world always came with expectation, and expectation always turned into disappointment. It was on a rainy Wednesday, because in Olympia almost every day was rainy, that he finally broke the silence. Jade was on her knees on the floor, cleaning a stubborn stain on the waiting room carpet, when she heard his voice behind her. "Do you always work like you're running from something?" She stopped, hands frozen on the damp cloth. She turned her head slowly and found Edward leaning against the wall, arms crossed, expression calm. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation, but that didn't make the question any less invasive. Jade stood up, wiped her hands on her uniform pants, and answered in the most controlled voice she could manage, "I work like someone who needs to pay bills, Mr. Crane, and I prefer to keep my distance from bosses." The phrase came out sharper than she intended, but it was deliberate. She needed to re-establish boundaries, needed him to understand that this, whatever this was, couldn't continue. He didn't move, just tilted his head, as if pondering something. Distance or barrier? The question came low, almost gentle, and that's exactly why it hurt. Jade pressed her fingers against her palm, feeling her nails dig into her skin. That involuntary gesture, that reflex that brought her back when everything threatened to crumble. She took a deep breath and said, with all the firmness she still had, "Both, and for good reason." She expected him to give up, to step away, to go back to his luxurious office and leave her alone, but Edward Crane did none of that. He took a step forward, just one, enough to reduce the distance without invading her space, and then he said something that would echo in Jade's head for hours, days, weeks. "I didn't ask for closeness, I asked for honesty." The silence that followed was heavy. Jade didn't know how to respond, because the truth was she couldn't be honest. Not with him, not with anyone. Honesty was vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury for those who could afford to trust. She looked away, picked up the bucket of cleaning supplies, and mumbled something about needing to finish her work. Edward didn't insist. He just nodded and left, leaving her alone once more. But now the silence had a different weight. Now it carried the presence of something she couldn't name, but was already beginning to feel. That night, as she returned to the cramped apartment she shared with the smell of mold and overdue bills, Jade thought about her mother, Aurora Warren, the woman who taught her from an early age that powerful men don't approach out of kindness. That gentleness always comes with a price. That trust is the first step toward falling. And as much as Jade tried to convince herself that Edward was different, her mother's voice echoed louder. It always echoed. But something inside her, small, fragile, dangerous, was beginning to question whether that old voice still deserved to be heard, or if, for the first time in her life, she could risk believing that honesty wasn't a trap. It was just honesty. Jade didn't go to work on Thursday. For the first time in months, she simply couldn't get out of bed. She stayed there, curled up under the thin blanket, staring at the cracked ceiling of the apartment as tears silently streamed down her face. It had happened the night before. She was coming back from the grocery store, carrying 2 light bags, because she never bought much at once, when she saw the silhouette standing on the corner. Disheveled hair, slightly hunched posture, that way of taking up space that was unmistakable. Aurora Warren, the mother she'd been avoiding for over a year. The encounter was brief, painful. Aurora tried to hug her, said she was better now, that she wanted to fix things. She used all those words Jade had heard before, in different versions, always followed by broken promises and nights of muffled crying. Jade backed away, said she needed to go, and practically ran home. But the damage was already done, because it didn't matter how many miles she put between herself and her mother. Aurora always found a way to invade, to dig up everything Jade tried to keep buried. She called work in the morning, voice choked, making up some excuse about feeling unwell. The supervisor accepted without questioning. After all, Jade never missed work. She was invisible, punctual, reliable. No one would ask questions. No one would care. She hung up the phone, tossed it on the bed, and went back to wrapping herself in the blanket. She wanted to disappear, wanted the world to stop spinning for a few hours, desperately wanted the pain in her chest to have an off switch. It was around 3 in the afternoon when someone knocked on the door. Jade ignored it. They knocked again. She pulled the blanket over her head, as if that could make her truly invisible. But then she heard the voice. "Jade, it's me, Edward." The name cut through the tiny apartment and reached her like an electric shock. She got up on impulse, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and went to the door without even looking in the mirror. She opened it just a crack. Edward was there, without a suit this time, just a button-down shirt and jeans, hair slightly messed up from the rain. And that expression, genuine concern, without disguise. What are you doing here?" Jade's voice came out weaker than she would have liked. He didn't answer immediately, just looked at her, at the swollen face, at the red eyes, at the posture of someone clearly holding herself together to keep from falling apart. "You didn't come to work, didn't answer messages. I was worried." Jade felt something twist inside her chest. Anger, shame, relief, all mixed together, all at once. "You didn't need to come. I'm fine." An obvious lie. He knew it, she knew he knew it, but still she tried to close the door. Edward held it with his hand, gentle but firm. "Can I come in?" She hesitated. Every voice inside her head screamed no, that this was an invasion, that she couldn't show weakness, that men like him didn't show up at the doors of women like her without wanting something in return. But there was another voice, lower, almost inaudible, whispering something different, saying what if he just wanted to be here. Jade stepped back, letting the door open. Edward entered slowly, looking around the cramped space without passing judgment, just observing. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't demand explanations. He just said, with that calm that was already beginning to disarm her, "No one ever taught you that asking for help doesn't make you less, did they?" The phrase hit Jade like a punch to the stomach, because it was true. No one had ever taught her that. Aurora had taught her the opposite, that help came with debt, that vulnerability was weakness, that the world was a place where only the strong survived. And she had believed it, had built her entire life on top of that belief. But now, There, with Edward standing in the tiny living room of her apartment, Jade felt something crack, a small fissure, but deep. And for the first time, she didn't try to fix it immediately. Jade went back to work the following Monday, not because she was ready, but because staying still in the apartment only made everything harder. Edward didn't insist on talking after that afternoon. He just stayed with her for a few hours, in silence, until he was sure she was minimally stable, and then he left. No demands, no promises. He just was there. And that confused Jade more than any words could, because she didn't know how to process kindness that didn't ask for anything in return. The routine returned to normal for 2 days. Jade cleaned, disappeared, went home. Edward crossed paths with her in the hallways, but kept a respectful distance. Just a nod, sometimes a discreet good morning. Nothing that forced her to respond beyond what was necessary. She was grateful for that. At least, that's what she told herself. But a part of her, small and insistent, missed those interrupted conversations, that uncomfortable attention that made her feel seen. It was on Wednesday that everything collapsed. Jade was cleaning Mrs. Langford's mansion, one of the company's most demanding clients, known for inspecting every corner after the work was done. The house was huge, full of expensive objects arranged strategically to look casual. Jade always took extra care there, never touched anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, but when she finished the living room and was putting away the supplies, she heard the shrill voice coming from the hallway. "What happened here?" Mrs. Langford was standing next to a side table, holding the shards of a crystal figurine. Her face was a mask of perfectly calibrated indignation. Jade felt her heart race. I didn't touch that." Her voice came out shaky, and she hated how it sounded, weak, desperate, guilty. The woman raised an eyebrow, looking at Jade the way one looks at something unpleasant they just stepped on. "Of course you touched it. You're the only one who's been here. That piece was worth more than you make in 6 months." Each word fell like lead. Jade tried to explain, but Mrs. Langford was already dialing the company, demanding to speak with someone competent. The humiliation was quick and efficient. Jade was called back to the central office. Edward was there, the supervisor too. Mrs. Langford repeated the accusation with that tone of superiority that only people accustomed to being obeyed can have. Jade stood there, hands pressed against each other, nails digging into her skin. She didn't cry, didn't shout, just stood there, swallowing the injustice while feeling the ground disappear beneath her feet. And then Edward spoke. "Mrs. Langford, with all due respect, Jade has worked here for months. There's never been a single complaint. I believe there may have been a misunderstanding." The silence that followed was thick. Mrs. Langford looked at Edward as if he had committed a betrayal. "You're defending a cleaning lady against a client's word." The way she said it, cleaning lady, carried all the contempt Jade had felt her entire life. But Edward didn't back down. "I'm defending someone I trust." The phrase should have sounded like relief, should have calmed Jade. But that's not what happened, because all she heard was her mother's voice echoing, "He's defending you now, but it's because he wants something. Nobody does anything for free." When the meeting ended, with Mrs. Langford leaving furious and the supervisor muttering something about handling this internally, Jade stood in the hallway, staring at the floor. Edward approached, but she raised her hand before he could speak. "I want to change routes." Her voice came out firm, but broken at the edges. He frowned. "Why?" Jade finally raised her eyes, and there was something there he hadn't seen yet, fear mixed with anger. "Because I don't want you defending me. I don't want people thinking I have privileges. I don't want—" She stopped, took a deep breath. "I don't want pity." Edward took a step forward, But she stepped back. He stopped immediately, respecting her space. But the frustration was visible now. "Jade, this isn't pity. I believe in you. There's a difference." She let out a bitter laugh. "Is there? Because to me it looks exactly the same." The words came out harder than she intended, but it was too late to take them back. Edward ran his hand through his hair, clearly trying to stay calm, and then he said something that would stay with her for a long time. "If trusting you hurts you, then what do you want me to do?" Jade didn't know how to answer, because the truth was she didn't know what she wanted, didn't know how to deal with someone who insisted on seeing her even when she did everything to disappear. So she did what she always did when things got too heavy. She ran. She requested a transfer the next day, changed routes, avoided the floors where he worked, and spent the following weeks convinced she had done the right thing. But at night, when the silence of the apartment got too loud, Jade pressed her fingers against her palm and wondered if running from someone who sees you was really protection, or just another way of losing yourself. 3 weeks passed in silence. Jade cleaned other floors, other rooms, avoided the hallways where Edward might be. She created mental routes to avoid crossing paths with him, checked schedules, made herself invisible again, as she always should have been. But invisibility this time weighed differently, because now she knew what it was to be seen, and going back hurt more than never having experienced it. It was on a Friday afternoon, while she was cleaning the underground parking garage, a task no one liked, but that she accepted without complaining, that she heard footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. She recognized the sound before even turning around. Edward stopped a few meters away, hands in his pockets, posture more tired than she remembered. He didn't say, "Hi," didn't ask how she was, just stood there, like someone waiting for permission to exist in the same space, and then, with that low voice that no longer startled her, just pierced through, "Are you going to keep running, or can we talk?" Jade dropped the cloth on the floor, wiped her hands on her uniform pants, and crossed her arms. It wasn't defense, it was protection. There was a difference. "I'm not running, I'm working." He gave a half smile, one of those sad ones that carry accumulated exhaustion. "Jade, you changed routes. Avoid the places where I go. Leave early on days you know I stay late. If that's not running, I don't know what is." The way he said it, without accusation, just observation, disarmed something inside her. Because he was right, and she knew it. She let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of weeks trying to convince herself she was doing the right thing. "I don't know how to do this." The confession came out low, almost inaudible. Edward took a step forward, but stopped when he saw her stiffen. "Do what?" Jade looked at the floor, at her own hands, anywhere but his eyes. "Trust, believe that you won't give up, that you won't get tired, that this isn't just, I don't know, curiosity." Her voice trembled at the end, and she hated it, hated exposing herself like that. But it was too late to take it back. Edward was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to one of the concrete columns and leaned against it, keeping his distance but present. "Jade, I won't lie and say I know exactly what this will be. I don't. But I know that when you disappeared, I missed you, not the employee. You." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "And if you need time, that's fine. If you need space, I respect that. But don't ask me to pretend you don't matter, because you do. And pretending otherwise would be a lie." Something inside Jade began to give, not all at once, not dramatically, just give, like a door that had been locked for so long it forgot what it was to open. She took a deep breath, pressed her fingers against her palm, but this time not to anchor fear, to let go. "I don't want to ruin this." Her voice came out almost in a whisper. He tilted his head. "Ruin what?" She finally raised her eyes. "Whatever this is, I'm not good at trusting, at believing things can be different. My mother always said that—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "That men like you don't look at women like me without wanting something." Edward didn't look away, didn't minimize. Just said, with an honesty that went through her, "Your mother was wrong." 3 words, simple, direct, but carrying the weight of everything Jade needed to hear. He continued, voice firm but gentle. "I don't want anything from you except what you want to give me. And if it's just friendship, that's fine. If it's more, that's fine too. But I won't give up just because it's hard. You deserve someone who stays. And I want to be that person." They stayed there longer than they should have, talking, really talking, without masks. Jade told him about Aurora, about the unstable childhood, about the broken promises and the patterns she swore she'd never repeat. Edward listened to everything, without interrupting, without judging. And when she finished, he shared something too, the loneliness of being seen only as a position, never as a person. How the people around him always wanted something, and how that made him distrust any closeness, until he met someone who treated him just as Edward. At the end of that conversation, they decided to try, without rushing, without demands, just staying in touch outside of work, occasional lunches, simple messages, conversations that didn't need to solve everything at once. And for the first time, Jade allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, trusting wasn't synonymous with losing. Maybe it was the beginning of finding. 6 months later, Jade opened the apartment door, now a little bigger, a little more organized, and found Edward sitting on the couch, reading a book she had recommended. He looked up and smiled in that way that no longer scared her, just warmed her. "How was therapy?" She tossed her bag in the corner and sat down next to him. "Good. We talked about boundaries, about how I still have trouble asking for help." He nodded, understanding. Because in the couples therapy sessions they did together, he was also learning about patience, about respecting her time, about building something solid, brick by brick. Jade rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the weight of the day drain from her shoulders. Edward put his arm around her, not squeezing too tight, just holding. And then he said, with that voice that now sounded like home, "You know what I always say?" She smiled, already knowing the answer, "that the best thing you found at the office was me." He laughed softly. "Exactly. And it's still true." Jade closed her eyes, allowing herself, finally, to believe. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't running. She was staying. And that simple act of remaining, was the truest love she had ever felt. Jade never imagined that her birthday, eating a piece of cake alone on the cold floor of an office, would be the beginning of something that would change everything. She didn't know that someone would walk into that room and, instead of ignoring her, would choose to see her, really see her. And maybe that's exactly what true love does. It finds you in your most vulnerable moments and decides to stay, even when it would be easier to walk right past. The story of Jade and Edward wasn't built on grand gestures or cinematic declarations. It was raised brick by brick, conversation by conversation, fear faced by fear faced. Because the love that transforms isn't the one that promises perfection. It's the one that chooses to remain, even when it gets hard. It's the one that respects time, that honors scars, that understands that trusting is a daily act of courage. Just as she discovered that love can change everything, each of us also carries that power of transformation within ourselves. We can choose to believe again, even after being hurt. We can allow someone to break through our defenses, not to weaken us, but to show us that strength also exists in being vulnerable. Jade learned that asking for help doesn't diminish anyone. In fact, it's one of the most courageous gestures we can make. Stories like this remind us that it's never too late to start over and believe in love, that each of us deserves to find someone who stays. that the scars of the past don't have to determine the future, and that sometimes the truest love is the one that teaches us, with infinite patience, that we are worthy of being seen, heard, and loved exactly as we are. If this story touched you in some way, if you've also felt that you needed to protect yourself too much, or that trusting was too risky, write in the comments. Love transforms lives. Let that message echo, because when we share these words, we remind each other that we're not alone on this journey. Subscribe to Eternal Romance Stories and experience, with each episode, emotions that warm the soul and reflections that transform the heart. Here you'll find stories that don't just entertain, they touch, inspire, and remind us of what really matters: connection, affection, the courage to feel. And this was just one of many stories that will still move you here. Because every heart holds a story, and the next one might be even more powerful than you imagine.